this has been a big month for you, a lot of conversations. What's it been like seeing all of this unfold in the Middle East this month?
Well, I think it's been pretty terrifying, really. I mean, I think not only the awful atrocities committed against innocent civilians and the loss of human life that's happened. I mean, I think this carries real risks of a broader regional conflict. I mean, a war right across the Middle East. And I think we're at quite a dangerous moment in the Middle East. So I think there is a real risk that Iran, escalates this conflict and we end up in a much broader war.
So why do you think we've seen such a different response to this conflict from the world in comparison to Russia's invasion?
Look, I think unfortunately, it speaks to a sort of a moral or ethical decay or confusion, I think, in many Western societies where identity politics has come to trump universal values. Now, if you look at this through a prism of universal values and human rights, it's clear, firstly, that the party that provoked this conflict was Hamas, that the way it behaved was a violation of all of the norms and rules of armed conflict and war. If you take a human rights or a universalist perspective, you'd have to recognise that's wrong. And equally, you'd recognise that Israel has a right to act in self-defence and remove the cause of that threat. But I think what we've seen in the West is sort of that people are now very focused on narratives and they like a very binary, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, or who is the powerful group and who is the less powerful group. And that's really what identity politics has been about. And everything sort of follows from that. And in that sort of worldview and with that kind of paradigm, the victims can never do anything wrong and the oppressors are always at fault.
Just a few days ago, we had 6 former prime ministers release a joint statement condemning Hamas. What did you make of the letter?
Well, I thought it was an important intervention in the political debate in Australia because it's people who've held high public office who represent different strands of political opinion and different political parties within Australia, but that agree enough around a set of common norms and values and principles, both about how we should approach, terrorist groups and barbarism overseas and our commitment to universal values, but also how we need to preserve Australia's multi-ethnic, diverse society here and what is permissible within those sorts of, civic value framework and what is not permissible. So I welcomed it. I thought it was quite a powerful statement of shared commitment and belief.
The federal government recently, received a lot of criticism recently for abstaining from a United Nations resolution urging for a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you think we made a mistake on abstaining from that vote?
Well, I think we should have voted against that resolution. I mean, what that resolution proposed was, look, firstly, a ceasefire. I don't think there can be any durable basis for a ceasefire until Hamas is demilitarized or no longer poses a military threat. But more importantly, there was nothing in that resolution which condemned Hamas for provoking this conflict or condemned Hamas for, terrorist attack on civilians and wanton killing of and abduction of civilians. I think we should have had the courage of our convictions and voted against that text, as countries like the United States, but also countries like Papua New Guinea, for instance.
How do you feel seeing accusations of Israel committing war crimes in Gaza, both from the United Nations as well as other world leaders?
Well, I don't think, firstly, Israel must and should abide by international humanitarian law. And certainly my time in Israel and my familiarity with the Israeli Defense Forces means that I know they do take that commitment seriously because they know that their moral stature around the world and their legitimacy as a defence force relies upon that, but also because they do genuinely care for human life and civilian life, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish, whether it's Israeli or Palestinian. And I think those accusations that are being made are not actually underpinned by the laws of armed conflict, and they're often underpinned by completely false facts. I mean, we saw a number of people jump in and accuse Israel of conducting an airstrike on a hospital last week in Gaza. It subsequently, within hours, really became manifestly clear that, firstly, the hospital was not hit by an Israeli airstrike, but secondly, the cause of the fire in a car park adjacent to the hospital was a malfunctioning rocket fired by militants from within Gaza. The Arab world accused Israel of war crimes. The King of Jordan cancelled a visit by President Biden. There were protests on the streets on the basis of an entirely false set of facts that had been promulgated by Hamas. So I think, of course, people should demand adherence to international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict, and people should hold Israel to that standard. But they need to be quite, I think, judicious before they make accusations that there is, in fact, evidence to support such accusations. The fact that Israel is exercising a right to self-defense does not make it guilty of war crimes. That right to self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter and in other bodies. And as long as their primary target is Hamas and Hamas military infrastructure and Hamas military assets, then they are entitled to wage that conflict in order to exercise that right of self-defense.
We've heard that point a lot about the right to self-defense, but I mean, after we've had the Gaza Health Ministry report over 8,000 civilians dead, Al Jazeera has reported some of their journalists have been killed by airstrikes. We've had aid workers killed. Can we keep calling it self-defense when we're seeing these numbers just go up and up and up?
The terrible reality of armed conflict is, though, that there are civilian casualties, and that's why no one should ever invite a war and no one should ever start a war. But the obligation on that nation exercising its right to self-defense is to take steps to seek to minimise those civilian casualties. Now, what you've seen Israel do is issue multiple evacuation orders for Gazan civilians to move to other parts of Gaza, the southern part of Gaza, but also warn occupants of individual buildings, which they frequently do, that they should get out because a strike is coming. Now, so to the extent that civilians are being killed, and I think it's terrible and tragic, and every life that is lost in this conflict is sad, we need to recognise that Hamas is the governing authority here in Gaza. Hamas has a duty to seek to minimise civilian casualties as well, and it's acting completely in contradiction of that.
What do you think of the Australian government's response and position on the conflict overall? How do you think that we've responded to it?
Well, I think bluntly, I think it's been poorly handled. I mean, I'd make a few points here. Firstly, it's been over 3 weeks since these terrorist attacks took place in Israel. This was the largest loss of Jewish civilian life in a single day since the Holocaust. It's by far the worst tragedy to befall the modern day state of Israel. But in that time, Anthony Albanese hasn't spoken to his counterpart, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to express condolences. And also, more worryingly, it's inflamed tensions within Australia, because if you've got cabinet ministers going around saying that, well, firstly, refusing to contest a claim that Israel is exercising genocide, just letting that one go through to the keeper, as Tony Burke did, or accusing Israel of collective punishment, a war crime, as Ed Husic did.
We've had reports of aid being denied access to Palestine through Israel, as well as water being cut off to citizens and civilians in Gaza. Is that not a form of collective punishment by Israel?
I think people here have the wrong understanding about what the responsibilities of Israel are. I mean, Israel and Gaza are in a state of war. Now, when France and Germany were in a state of war, in the First World War or the Second World War, was France compelled to provide Germany food and water and electricity? North and South Korea are in a state of war. They've got a truce. They don't have a peace treaty. Is South Korea obliged to provide North Korea with food, humanitarian assistance, fuel and water? Now, in this instance, the sovereign authority is Hamas. It's quite clear that Hamas has stockpiles, several months' worth of fuel and food and water. And they also have a border crossing with Egypt, which is operational and can be opened further by the Egyptians. So that is where the solution to this conflict lies. But I think it's wrong as a matter of international law, but it's also wrong as a matter of logic to say that when two states are at war with one another, one state has the obligation to provide the other with humanitarian assistance. It's simply not correct.